So here's our Zoom screen. So we have a whole bunch of guests. So give them a hand.
Hey, folks.
Welcome, welcome.
I wish
Okay.
I were there. I wish I were with you.
So tonight we have a presentation about the west coast of Vancouver Island, and our very own Andy Hansen is going to be the speaker. He is currently in Bozeman, Montana, where he's a professor of ecology at Montana State University. And why don't I hand the word over now to Andy? With that, I'll stop my screen share.
Hey, thanks so much, Andreas. Again, it's great to be with you all. Okay, well, again, folks, looking forward to chatting with you. I hope we'll have good discussion. I'm not going to yak too long, and there'll be plenty of time for questions. Little geography, maybe, start. Vancouver Island, turns out it's the largest island on the west coast of the Americas. And of course, it's just amazing in terms of being mostly remote and just on the ragged edge of the continent, as you can see here. It's 280 miles north-south. I'll just get a pointer here. "280 miles north-south and 65 miles across." So a circumnavigation's a heck of a long ways. Of course, most people live in the southern part of the island, in the area of Victoria and Nanaimo.
Uh-oh.
Or some of the smaller towns up on the east side of the island. But most of it is really without cities or towns or even roads. There are 5 sounds that cut way into this west side of the island: Quatsino, Yacht, Nootka, Clayoquot Sound here by Tofino, and then Barkley Sound. And you can see how extensive they are. So there's a lot of great coastline and anchorages within those, in addition to what we find along the west coast. I was so surprised to learn that the geology of Vancouver Island is similar to Haida and to Southeast Alaska, in that all of these basically were islands, volcanic islands that formed offshore and then slid with the this Juan de Fuca plate and crashed into the North American plate, where the incoming plate basically was pushed under the North American plate, but these rocks were so hard and substantial that basically they just scraped along the top and got shoved right up against the North American plate. So we end up with the islands and also the volcanics like Mount Baker that resulted from the subduction zone. As Andreas said, we did most of our tours on our Tartan 35 Surcouf, and then just this year on Thea. So these are the 2 boats that Andreas mentioned that we did most of the trips in. And then, as he also said, we came up just part of the way up the west coast 3 times, twice to Barkley Sound, and then once up into Walters Cove, so the fourth sound up. And then the other trips were the circumnavigations, the first in 2012, and then actually the most recent being this year and this past summer. So let's let's start with in Port Hardy and just work around the island a bit, particularly focusing on the northern third, and we'll pretty much draw things to a close just after Nootka Sound. So leaving Port Hardy, you head up the Goletas Channel, and it just feels different from the inside passage as you head up there, because you know you're right on the edge of basically Queen Charlotte Sound. Everything about it feels more remote, more wetter, cloudier, colder, bigger winds. But there's some really cool anchorages in this region. It's really worth checking out the multiple anchorages. You can see how, particularly this last summer, how we've crisscrossed this area. One of the bays that we like is called Clam Cove. And it's one of my favorites because, so basically the ocean is right here. And then you've got a netting of barrier islands. And then the anchorage is just sweeping in and right here. So here's the boat sitting in there. We're now looking from the outside in. And you feel the swells, particularly at high tide, coming in, rocking the boat, and all the kelp. And it's just it's protected, but you feel like you're at the edge. It's a great place for prawning and for fishing. And you pretty much never see anybody at that place. And then, of course, the main jumping off point for going around Cape Scott is Bull Harbor here on Hope Island. Now this is an aerial view from Goletas Channel looking up into Bull Harbor. You can see how it's quite protected with this island protecting it from the southerlies and the land peninsula from the northerlies. This is all native owned. The dock's maintained by the band that has the land here. And it used to be that you could walk across this isthmus to these outer beaches. They're just spectacular. They're spectacular. So here's Noreen enjoying one of them. And you're not alone when you're out there. These are wolf tracks. And lots of other wildlife are there. Unfortunately, you're not allowed to walk off the dock anymore. There were various issues with, I guess, the cruisers, and now the natives are not allowing people to go out across there. So as I was working on this presentation, I got to thinking, geez, have I learned anything in 11 years of doing this? And it took a while to come up with anything I did learn, right? But this is one of the most important ones I found. I tend to be kind of a private person, but now I just go out of my way to try to get to know the other boaters. Because it's more enjoyable and it's safer, because we often end up doing the hard roundings together. So these are a couple boats we met the first year up there, and we actually cruised with this boat most of the way around. And then here in 22, we met some guys from just across the border in Lardner, BC, just across from Bellingham, in Port Hardy, and we pretty much did the whole rounding together. That's them anchored in the back with us in the front, and we left in the morning. In addition to the safety of it all, you find that as the years go by, you make more and more friends, and they live along the route, and you get to go visit with them and have dinner and drinks, as we did here and with these sailing friends in Nanaimo. Okay, so now it's time to think about going to Cape Scott. the Nawadi Bar, so here we are in Bull Harbor, and the Nawadi Bar extends right across through here. As you can see, it's basically the gateway to the Pacific. It's only 20 feet deep at low tide, and the outgoing current from the Goletas Channel meets up with the incoming storm swells from the North Pacific, setting up, potentially huge seas. So hitting it at slack tide is critical. But even so, I met a guy in Port Hardy. He was probably in his 80s. He had fished this area his whole life. It was pretty unforgettable. He said, "It can be bad. I hate crossing that bee of a place." And that pretty much convinced me to take what's called this Patternal Reefs sneak, as indicated by the black line here. That it's only about 20 feet deep, and it's protected by kelp, basically, from the swells. And it allows you to actually leave about 2 hours before slack at the bar, and then do the 15 miles or so out to Cape Scott and get there right at slack, which is exactly what you want to do. It's important to give Cape Scott plenty of room, because there's very confused currents from the outflow from the Goletas Channel. And as I said, the incoming northwestern swells. And then there's a strong current. It turns out it was running north when we were there this past summer, 3 knots. So it's a place that you pick the weather, you work with the tides, and if you selected well, it looks like this. So this is Nora looking over to Cape Scott, and it's just a lovely, calm day, about as good as it gets there. So the first anchorage, as you round from Cape Scott going south, is what's called Sea Otter Cove, as shown here and charted here. Your eyes probably aren't good enough to see these fathom readings. It's mostly 1 fathom the whole way in. So we dropped in there thinking it'd be a cool place to spend the night. And it was not a super high tide condition. So basically we were drawing 7 feet, and the wind was blowing 20. And I felt like this is no place to be overnight. So we basically pulled right out of there. I think if it's going to be a 5-foot low tide or something, it would be fine. And a lot of people do use this. But it's not one that we chose to use that particular, under those conditions. Before we get too far south, it's probably worth thinking about the human history on the island. Of course, we know that North America was likely peopled by folks from Siberia crossing the Bering Land Bridge during glacial times, particularly through an ice-free corridor east of the Rockies, basically, and coming down into the Midwestern US. That's been the leading theory now for 40, 50 years. It was just 2 years ago that this was discovered, human footprints. On Calvert Island. This is just 50 miles north of Bull Harbor. And we've actually, Nora and I have walked these beaches. beautiful place. Maybe that's why these people were walking down this beach 13,000 years ago. The current thinking is that the Americas were likely peopled via the so-called Kelp Highway, that instead of crossing the ice in the interior, that they stayed in the ice-free zone right along the seacoast, particularly as the glaciers were retreating, the land was rising, and new lands were forming right along that edge. And of course, the benefit would have been the amount of food available from that very rich marine coastal environment. So isn't it amazing that the places we go and hang out on our boats are the places that have this kind of history? That really was the start of a pretty amazing 9,000-year run. So it wasn't until the forests started migrating back north following deglaciation that the native people really were able to prosper. And it's specifically due to one tree species, the Western red cedar, that got onto Vancouver Island about 9,000 years ago. And of course, it provided much of what people would need in terms of resources for clothing, for basketry, for transportation, for art, for warfare. And that really allowed the coastal populations to increase in size. And pretty much, well, completely occupied the whole northwest coast. But in the case of Vancouver Island, these were various long-term village sites and 3 different tribes that occupied that region. So they held sway there for what? A huge amount of time, more than we've been in the New World. I think it's important to recognize that. Well, it turns out that things changed a bunch when the first Europeans arrived, but let's visit that a little bit later. So we're continuing south from Sea Otter Cove, continuing down the outside. So we're now proceeding down the coast. Again, each of these outside passages, of course, gets your attention big time. And again, the right weather window, having the boat well equipped, all critical. Basically, you see nobody out here, particularly in May, June, when we're doing it. But you eventually get to come around the corner and come into Quatsino Sound and just feel your body relax as you get into friendlier waters. There's a lot of good anchorages in this area. There's also a small village, Winter Harbor, with the government dock. This is the harbor, this is the village. In 2011, when we were there, they claimed to have 7 year-round residents. That's the size of the place. It turned out that a gale had just come in the night after we arrived, and these are boats that we met there during the 4 days that we were weathered in to this town of 7 people. It was fun. It was a good time to get to know them. It turned out this boat is a British-built 31, an offshore 31 from the 80s that a couple from Australia had just sailed via Japan to Seward, where they wintered and had a baby. And now the baby was 9 months old and is cruising the West Coast with them. They had an old car seat that they strapped into the cockpit to keep the baby in when the seas were rough. And then she was out during this gale hanging the wet diapers that she had just washed under this awning with no hope of drying. And then this was Surku, our boat, and then a 32-foot wooden boat built by a retired architect who lives in Victoria. A really nice guy. Nora also had plenty of time to try to catch up on teaching her online courses. The only internet available was out of the general store. That's just up here on up the wharf. But the owner at that time was alcoholic, so basically the store was never open. His cat, Smudge, most of the time was just out in the rain with his drenching fur, but it loved when Nora came and sat on the bench. They would both huddle, trying to be just out of the wind and rain while Nora was working on the computer. And so Smudge became best buddies with Nora during that time. It was also interesting that there was a 130-foot ship tied up just off the stern here on a larger dock, a research vessel. It left the second day to head south. It was blowing 50 knots outside, is what the forecast indicated. Would you believe they came back 2 hours later?
Well,
That ship could not handle the conditions for heading south. We all took that as a big message, and we waited until the wind died before leaving. The next stage is basically to get around the Brooks Peninsula. So Winter Harbor is just up here. The Brooks is about 10 miles, extending like a big old nose out into the ocean, 10 miles off the island, and then it's 7 miles across. So it's basically 30 miles from the closest anchorage to the north to the closest anchorage in the south. And it's basically the badass place of the West Coast, right? It gets the biggest weather right off Solander Island right here. You can see the portion of time here that the wind's blowing 20 or more. It looks like more than half the time in June, the wind's blowing 20 plus. So again, it's a place where one wants to be well equipped and pick the weather window appropriately. We left Winter Harbor in order to get to that northerly anchorage from the Brooks, Clackash Bay. It turned out the wind had died after the gale, but it was 16-foot seas right on the beam coming in here. So we were just rocking and rolling. And then when it came time to turn in, all I saw were breaking waves the whole way across here, crashing on the rock stacks that stick up and plug this bay. And it was one of those hard choices. Do you trust the guidebook? Is there really a path through there or not? And it turned out there was. And this then is the entrance. You go about eight or 10 miles up this really narrow channel now away from that turmoil of that coast and into Clackash Bay, which is this spectacular remote bay with a big river that flows in the head that you can actually run your dinghy up. We quite enjoyed that night, and it turned out our friends from Bull Harbor, or from Winter Harbor, they pulled in just before sunset. Little did we know that the next day was going to be one of mechanical issues. Um, we got up at ballistically early the next morning to get around the brooks. And I hit the ignition in the cockpit. Nothing happens. For the first time in the history of Surcouf, the boat doesn't start. And I'm thinking, well, how many days away could any kind of help be? Fortunately, we had just the spring before, under San Juan Sailings, who we had chartered, who we put the boat in charter with, we had installed an emergency start switch right at the engine. And amazingly, it worked. And the engine fired up. It turned out I had left the radar on mistakenly the night before, and that ran the batteries down. So we were on our merry way, rounding the brooks. It almost looks like Cape Horn, right? Under the normal rainy, cloudy conditions. This is Solander Island and the outermost portion. One of the really cool things there is it's an amazing seabird colony, including tufted puffins. It's the only place that Nora and I have regularly seen puffins is right off Solander Island. So as you continue around, eventually you head into Brooks Bay. And I do want you to notice that this is all an ecological reserve. So this whole region really is complete wilderness, which just adds to the spectacular nature. But you just, again, feel calm as you round into this more settled condition. When the northerlies are blowing, this is all quite calm, and into Columbia Cove. This is what it looks like as you come into Brooks Bay, beautiful wilderness forest. And then the serenity of Columbia Cove with two other boats in there. Spectacular, really fine white sand beach. So we were intrigued by this boat. You notice that it's just, the topsides are just totally covered with debris. And it turns out that this guy is called the beachcomber. He calls himself the beachcomber. And he and his wife spend each summer, they had for 13 years, going to the most remote parts of the coast to collect treasures, particularly things that have come across from Asia. And he just tied them all onto the outside of his boat. And then at the end of the summer, goes back to his home in Salt Spring Island and markets the goods. So I thought that was what a fabulous business, and what a great way to spend the summer. I didn't mention, did I, that as we were rounding the brooks, we had one other mechanical issue. It was still 12-foot seas. The boat was rocking around pretty good. When, of course, Nora comes up and says, "There's smoke filling the cabin." And then pretty soon a terrible alarm goes off, high engine temperature alarm. So we shut down the engine. There's only less than 10 knots of wind. We're trying to sail, but just getting beat up in the sloppy conditions. And what else is there to do but basically get in and fully examine the raw water system, including taking off the raw water pump and checking the impeller with those 6 tiny nuts that you just know are going to run away and disappear and be lost in a rolling sea. Well, it turned out that we couldn't find anything wrong, and put it back together again, and then motored up, but only ran at half RPMs, and the temperature stayed adequately low. So that allowed us to get to Columbia Cove. So I dug into the system again and found that it was basically the raw water strainer was allowing some air to leak into it. And when I took it apart, there was just, this is like the O-ring in the space shuttle. There was just an eighth of an inch piece of driftwood that got wedged under that strainer and prevented the lid of the strainer from closing fully, allowing air to get into the system and not having the cooling effect. Again, glad to solve the problem because it wasn't clear how we'd do it otherwise. And that sort of brought up one other, thinking about lessons learned. No surprise to any of you, we would all love to do this, wouldn't we? Minimize mechanical failure. How do you do that? Well, the best thing I found from having our boat in the San Juan sail fleet for 5 years was learning about their maintenance routine. It's on the order of a 12 or 13 page long list for winter and spring. But following it religiously, I think, avoids a lot of the common problems. And then even so, we had lots of things arise and they tend to repeat themselves. Our starters would go out, for example. And so by knowing the history of the boat and the failures and how to fix it, it allows you to plan accordingly. So just a list of things I've learned about to try to minimize problems, the carrying the spares, to learn how to fix the boat yourself as best as your abilities allow. Mine are not very good. And so I tend to try to be good friends with my maintenance pro so that when I call him from the wilderness, he'll answer and he'll help me get solve the problem. So it's a pretty gentle run through the Bunsby Islands then from Columbia Cove into Walters Cove in Quiet Sound, the next major sound. This is a really cool village of natives with lots of kids and a bakery, some sports fishing boats over in this side of the bay, very well protected. We did have an interesting incident on that time that we came north up the coast, because we went straight in Quiet Sound to Hoa Island and anchored in this really cool place. Turns out to be it's far enough away from anything that there's no VHF coverage there, and hence no marine radio forecast available. But the weather was calm, and the next day we motored out, planning to go through a very narrow opening to get over to Walters Cove. It was flat calm through here, and then the wind picked up a little bit here, but no worries. I see this opening is only about 2 boat lengths wide. You know, it's hard to tell from the electronic chart how wide, what the scale is. It was narrow, but it seemed fine. It turned out that basically, just as we entered it, we realized that it was blowing 35 out here straight in with probably 4-meter seas. And they were crashing exactly in that opening. You know, 12 hours without VHF, and we missed that a gale's coming. There was no opportunity to turn back at this point, to turn around. It was that abrupt and sudden. I decided the autopilot was better than I was, and left it drive through. As the swells came through, the rocks on either side just looked like they were rising up. You could spit out either side of the boat and hit a rock. It was absolutely terrifying. But the autopilot did get us through it. We then had a pretty challenging time getting back into the government dock in Walters Cove in 35-knot winds and very tight maneuvering in here. But again, just an example of how doo-doo happens. And now we carry a device where we can get a weather forecast even if we are away from VHF. So then it's pretty easy going to do another outside passage back into Esperanza Inlet and then into Nootka Sound. So in interest of time, I'm going to take us right down to Friendly Cove, right at the mouth of Nootka Sound. You probably know about this. It has, a pretty amazing history. This is where Captain Cook sought refuge from a storm in 1789. He basically he couldn't see the coast from Cape Foulweather all the way north, and things didn't break till he got way up to Nootka Sound. And they came in and found the thriving native village there, and discovered, of course, sea otter and the quality of their furs. That really began the sea otter trade. And in the following decades, Nootka Sound became the largest European trading center north of Mexico. A really good read is this book, A Narrative of Adventure and Suffering by John J. Jewett. He came in just 10 years after Captain Cook on an American ship, the Boston. By then, the natives had been totally alienated by the traders, the European traders. The chief actually attacked the crew of the Boston and killed every one of them, except Jewett, who was down below. And because he was a metal worker, they took him as a slave to make weapons. So he lived with the natives for 2 years, and his writing is pretty much the only description I know of the truly traditional ways of those peoples. Turned out he escaped after 2 years and returned to England to tell his story. Well, of course, that was not the end of the sadness. The genocide came with the diseases that Cook and those other sailors brought. And there was basically a 95% mortality rate. After 9,000 years, that civilization was basically completely wiped out. And as we know, our ancestors then came in and through the fur trade, killed every sea otter except 20 that survived in Monterey, California, and cut valuable old growth forest and wiped out most of the salmon to the point where they could not persist there. The European settlers could not make it. And so the area, was largely abandoned. And so when you sail up there today, you don't see anybody because there's fewer people there now than there has been for at least 9,000 years. Of course, we have the mega cities in Seattle and Vancouver, but as soon as you get 100 miles north, it's complete wilderness. And it really raises the question of what's next? What's going to happen in that coast next? And those are the kind of things that, you think a lot about during time out there. The thing that I find really heartening is how the indigenous communities have really rebounded. After five generations post-genocide, many of them are thriving. This is the first pole raising on Haida Gwaii and Queen Charlotte City in 250 years. We got to be there for it. Haida Gwaii is the most progressive mixed white and indigenous community I know of anywhere. Just an incredible community. So things are on the rise there. And again, to close out, again, once you get south of Nootka Sound to Tofino and then Barkley Sound, things get a lot friendlier. You got Hot Springs Cove that Nora's enjoying, and great anchorages in Barkley Sound and good sailing. The Strait of Juan de Fuca is always a challenge, but eventually you get through Race Rocks and the ocean swells end, and you get to meet up with your friends in the Salish Sea, and a great voyage has come to an end. So that's what I wanted to share with you guys. And
Thank you.
hey, thank you guys for hanging in there.
Oh,
Yeah.
that was an absolute delight, Andy. Thank you so much.
Sweet. How's the BS meter on those tails, Neil?
The BS meter? No, it's pretty good. Although you didn't emphasize the rain, which is what I heard when I first heard about your trip. So, yeah, that was good.
My husband and I did that trip
No,
several
and I really liked
times.
it.
It's wonderful.
How was your experience? Did it go well?
Yes, there were some tricky times, but there were a lot fewer people out there when we were there 25, 30 years ago.
Really? What kind of boat were you on?
We had a San Juan 24 on the first run, and a Creelock 34 was the last one, and we had a couple boats in between. It was a wonderful trip. And some of your same experiences, and we didn't get inland quite as much as you did.
Well, good for you.
San Juan 24.
Yes.
Did you actually go outside with the 24?
Just from the south. Our circumnavigations, we had a 32 and then a 34.
Yeah, we had a San Juan 24 also out of Newport, Oregon, and we picked 2-hour windows when the weather was good and sail out Yaquina Bay, and loved it, but skirted right back in.
Yeah.
For anything.
Yeah. We thought we were out there all by ourselves, and we anchored off a little island on the northern coast, baked a loaf of bread, and we immediately had 3 fishing boats come over and say, "Are you baking bread?" So we shared our newly baked bread with the fishermen.
Nice. Well, I'll let you guys go. It's really nice visiting.
Thank you
Thank you,
very
Andy.
much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
It's a
Andy.
wonderful talk.
Wonderful talk.
Can I ask you a question? A question that is
Sure.
usually people don't like to answer, but this is Chris. What would you guesstimate is the percent of sailing versus motoring that you did that trip?
Yeah, one of the lessons learned was I'm getting a big echo. Yeah, so maybe if you guys could play. There we go. To get anywhere, motor sailing is the way to go. I pretty much found that to do those big 50 to 70 mile days on the outside, we largely motor sailed. That motor sailing is 2 to 4 times faster than sailing is what I've been finding. And it's about 10% faster than motoring, I find. But, I'm to the point now where I just really try to emphasize sailing. And that largely means looking at 15 to 20 mile days instead of 50 to 70 mile days. And so I now try to organize my schedule when possible to allow that, just because the sailing is so much more pleasurable. But I wonder, Chris, what you find in that regard.
Well, I think that in the San Juans, typically we, certainly motor more than we sail. And I think that that's, a hard thing when you are here for sailing, and you're very diplomatic in your answer and I appreciate it.
We found that we
Well,
did
definitely.
2/3 sailing, 2/3 motoring. So a third of the time we were doing both.
And I agree. I think if you do what you said, you shorten, you just don't go far. You have to go, you say you're going to sail and you go from A to B and you can't get to C, and that's okay. So, and I think that's what we've tried to do is change our mindset about how far do we get and where do we go, and not have, as the parties say, it's not the destination, it's not an ETA, it's the destination. So
Yeah, we, in some years, we specifically choose to just go to the Broughtons or to Barkley Sound or something, and just don't do any long motors, just sail. And I really enjoy that.
Hmm.
Okay, well, good deal. Really nice to see you all. Thanks for hanging in there. And I guess we have winter coming, and then before we know it, we'll be putting our sails back on, right?
Hope so.
Okay, I'll let you go. Take care.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
thanks, Andy.